AC Goldberg is a speech language pathologist and knows Joshua. So I said, we have to bring him into the camp space because I think there's a lot of good work here that needs to be done and is long overdue. So I have no more to say. I'm going to turn it over to Joshua and learn along with everyone else. All right, take it away.
All right, thank you, Chris, and everyone for having me. It's a pleasure to join you. Yat Ayabine, that means good morning in the Nepazad, which is Navajo language. I'm joining you from can't get any more closer to my ancestral homelands, which is in the Canyon de Chelly of Chinle, Arizona, which is historically ancestral Pueblo land, but now it's the Nebekea Navajo Nation. So I'm joining you from here. Yat Ayabine Shea Joshua Allison-Burbank Unishia Uganishle Kisani Bashchi Tohana Dashache Kisani Dashanella Akut Ego do Dene do Kisani Hestin Nishle. I just introduced you in my native language. I presented my clans, my mom's side, my dad's side. If there is anyone in the audience that is Navajo or Pueblo, I greet all of you with a nice virtual handshake this great morning. My presentation today is meant to be a bump, to give you momentum, a nudge, I should say, to continue this conversation in your own spaces. Today, we'll talk about cultural competency from the perspective of Indigenous communities. How do we give back this space? How do we allow people into this space to continue these conversations that sometimes are tough to have, or we avoid them as that elephant in the corner, or whatever idiom you want to use, things we don't often bring up. But I see in the chat, I have it pulled up, I see people from Maine, from the Adirondacks, from Mohawk country. I see folks from Micmac country. I think that's where you start, as you look at who are those keepers of the land and knowledge, that space before we came. In Michigan, Ojibwe country, I see. So again, think if you have not learned or heard about land acknowledgements, that's one important start. But also our own journey in cultural competency is what we have to be prioritizing as we think about how do we try to reconcile, how do we try to cohabitate or try to make things better. Most of you are from camp societies or camp communities, and I hope today gets you thinking more about that, about what your role is being out in the community and environment and working with youth, especially, because that's who we need to spend more time teaching this space, teaching this concept too, about how do we work to make things better? How do we promote tolerance, but also how do we do it from a decolonized lens, where we approach things where it's not, communities aren't siloed, or we're also approaching things where there's not a focus on a majority system, a majority belief, but we think more from that intersectional lens and really think about, again, the importance of land and people that existed before us. That's important. I can't move forward by in sharing and talking without acknowledging that I come to you from two different worlds, well, multiple experiences, but I have my native Indigenous way that I grew up. I'm Dene, and I'm from Acoma Pueblo here in the Southwest. But I also come to you as an assistant scientist, as a speech language pathologist. My main post is in the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where I do trauma and neurodevelopmental research with Indigenous youth. I work mostly out of our Albuquerque regional office. But with all these different hats I wear, I come to you knowing that I come from a bias. I come from a perspective that only I know and only I can change, really, as an Indigenous person. But I also grew up and went to school and did all these other things to pursue the career I'm in. So I come to you with two different experiences, two different shoes I've walked in. And you may have heard this saying before. I think it resonates so, especially now, about you don't know my experience, my lived experience, what I've gone through, unless you've walked in my shoes or my moccasins. And I think about this picture all the time. And you see, this was at Philly ASHA a couple years ago when I took those pictures. So today, just some real quick learning objectives. I only have an hour, about 54 minutes, I think. I hope to talk about historical trauma in the context of Indigenous community health. How do you promote wellness and well-being amongst adolescents and children? But how do you do it from a trauma-informed lens and a historical trauma-informed lens? I'm going to revisit this concept of cultural competency, and hopefully this will just be a review that you're already talking about this or you've already had trainings on this, but I can't talk about historical trauma and reparation work without talking about cultural competency. I also want to make sure that we think about how you're going to apply this lecture and these concepts to your work, your daily work. And I'm going to give you a homework assignment. It's a fun one. You don't have to go and read or do any essays. It's a fun one where I want you to go and explore more about you, where you're from, the intersectionality that you bring to the community. And hopefully this gets us thinking about how can we improve things in the work that we're doing with Indigenous communities. What we know about camp culture and what we know about a lot of work that's done in youth resilience work and youth training, from YMCAs to youth programs, enrichment programs, training programs, is that it's meant to stimulate some type of thinking or a new thought process. And in some cases, it's meant to give experiences to historically marginalized youth that have not had the chance to take part in certain recreational or certain community activities. That's how I understand it and what I think about in the camp and experiences that I've been in myself and projects I worked in with youth. So what I want us to be thinking about those is, like, when we are coming into a community as an outsider, very often we have a goal, we have objectives, we have aims that we need to go and accomplish. It's been a real important lesson for me to learn that sometimes that helicopter approach of coming in to try to save or do something to come in, that sometimes in Indigenous communities, that first approach can be the make or break deal. Because sometimes these communities already are doing stuff, or they have cultural routines or activities that are meant to provide those services to their youth. And for whatever reason, substance abuse, chronic disease, all these social determinants of health that can impact communities gets in the way of some of that. So what I'm trying to say with this slide here is that many of these communities already have been doing some of this work in their own ways, from a cultural lens, from a traditional lens, of where they're facilitating positive developmental growth, developmental trajectory, and resilience. And this is what we see here with myself pictured here with my son, who was he was probably about 7 or 8 years old at this time when he started participating in this particular dance here. I want to talk about co-regulation, this concept that's the precursor to self-regulation, that ability to regulate your emotions, your beliefs, how you feel. Before we get to that, we have to have co-regulation. And many times that starts with parents, grandparents, extended family members. But in Indigenous communities, that co-regulation often falls on the responsibility of the entire community, helping children to step into spaces where they can develop that confidence on their own, demonstrate skills when they're ready, explore their being, their who they are, and allow personality and beliefs and biases to develop on their own. Not so much saying, you're a young Navajo boy, this is what you need to do and learn. This is your girl, this is what you need to do. And that's where we run into trouble sometimes. And when we step into these spaces and we try to promote certain biases or certain beliefs and norms, we realize in Indigenous communities and other diverse groups that many times this gender socialization is fluid, that we allow children to develop these skills on their own. We model it as adults, as community members, but we let these kids develop on their own. We let them build these skills, we let them explore these interests, and we just advise them and guide them through this. This is what we see in this particular dance here and many other routines, is the young child watches, observes, and listens. And later on, I'll show a video of my youngest child doing just that, listening, observing, watching, and eventually jumping in when she's ready. That's what we should be aiming for. Presenting opportunities that are positive, enriching, and powerful, and also a model of what children can take advantage of, what they can do. And so sometimes when we're thinking about these CAM spaces and most education spaces, we have a set curriculum, we have set goals. We want to teach these particular skills, we want to teach these particular beliefs. Sometimes we run into trouble in doing that though, especially with communities where it's not like that, where kids don't learn like that. Again, I present you with a nice warm virtual handshake or fist bump, whatever you're into. And I want us to establish this as a safe place to talk, that I'm going to share, and I'm likely going to bring up stuff that's going to spark some emotion. It's meant to. That's the whole point of these talks of cultural competency and about historical trauma, is it's meant to bring emotion. But I want to meet you at empathy. I want to meet you at this understanding that I'm coming to you and being vulnerable. And what I know is that when I think about my biases and things that I do, it's flawed. My perspective on humanity is flawed. Yours is as well. So let's really think about meeting at that space of understanding and tolerance and empathy. I'm just going to pause here, and I want you to take a look at this picture. Two kids here looking at a statue, and one child here on the left is giving the finger. I want you to be really thinking about, what is Josh trying to show, or what's happening here? It's meant to be a reason that there's a reason why he's showing this, and there is. I want you to take just a couple seconds to explore and think what's happening here in your brain. There's a lot of reaction to what you're seeing here. Maybe some responding, thinking about how you might respond, or what questions you might present to me if I were to ask you, what do you see here, or what's happening in your brain here? But this is an important part in my lecture and my training to others about reacting versus responding. And I think if we as a society were to just take more time to respond rather than reacting, we'd be in a lot better place here. But that's another story for later, for next time. But what I want to get to is the picture here. This is my 11-year-old son and 5-year-old daughter, Kateri and Caleb here. And this was on Indigenous Peoples Day at a march in Albuquerque, New Mexico, unceded Tiwa lands along the Rio Grande River, where my dad's side of the family and my kids' mom's side of the family have ties to. But what you see here is a response to history and knowledge that these young kids are now being allowed to learn about the coming of Christianity, the coming of conquistadors, those that wore metal helmets, those that wore flags that had white crosses on it, and men in cloth robes that had crosses. The colonizers that came in 14, 15, 1600s that brought new beliefs, new interpretations, but did it from a colonized approach of saying, this is the only way to believe, that unless you believe this way, or you practice this way, or do this, you're not going to live, you're not going to survive. And that early form of contact and the following genocide that happened to Indigenous people, exploring that and learning that takes time, and it could be an entire course or entire degree even of understanding that impact of contact and with Indigenous communities. But what we see here is young kids interpreting, responding, and reacting, and thinking about what they've learned, the real history of American history, that these individuals brought oppression, and these individuals continue to represent oppression. And this is one kid being allowed to speak up, to fight back, to say, this is what I'm about, this is who I am, and this is how I'm going to make my stance. And here's my sister next to me, and she's going to do it along with me. And we're going to make this stance in this way because it makes me stronger, it makes me powerful, and it allows me to speak up. I really use this picture here now in my teaching to present it as a goal. Here's what we want Indigenous youth to be working towards. We want them to be able to, again, do all those things, express themselves openly, but also know the history. And for us to allow a space where we can let kids step into a space like this, to express themselves how they want, to learn survival skills and those life skills that we need them to know, but also to understand what their role is in advocacy, but also when it comes to navigating their community. And my only hope is that these young kids will grow up to channel this energy, this understanding into advocacy that's going to bring about systemic change, whether it's in their schools, their profession, or even educating someone else when they get their chance to speak. So as we share all this content today, as I share this content today, that's going to spark some emotion, I want you to be thinking, are you responding? Are you reacting? And what's causing some of that? It's challenging because in our society, especially American society, we have to fit into certain boxes, where we're forced to fit into boxes, I should say. These social constructs of race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, all these things where we have to fill it in. That's such an American thing. We have to be siloed and fit into spaces. So what I hope we do today is, in my approach, is getting you to ask yourself these questions. Who or what are we? Who, when you really think about it, deep down, what's influenced your biases, what's influenced your beliefs, and also what do you know about Indigenous communities already, and what have you learned today, so you can start to have these conversations more in your own spaces or in your own organizations in your community. But we can't do any of that without first defining culture. We live in a very multicultural world. When someone says they don't have a culture, that blows my mind. It just baffles me, because everyone has a culture, whether it's American culture or whatever. This is another thing we could talk about, but it is difficult to define. And very often we think about that above surface level when we're talking about cultural identity, what people eat, what people drink, how they talk, how they sound, what they do. But what we don't often think about is those ties that we have to have amongst one another, those that meet those biological and psychological needs. I love this definition here in that second bullet about a sum total of ways of living. What we know about just basic human needs is we need attachment. We need to have connection. And it's in those attachment, those connections, in which we build culture, or we already exist within a cultural group. And when we start to apply cultural competence, this means that whatever services we're doing, if we're providing a camp, or we're providing an intervention or a therapy session, as we think about how these experiences, the above surface piece, how those make a difference, but also underneath, those unwritten rules, those norms that we have, those beliefs that we have, very much influence how someone perceives who we are or how we act. And very often there's a clash there. And so what I want us to be thinking about is, when things change over time, when that clash happens, what do we do in those spaces? Or where do we start at least having a conversation about how do we make services better for a diverse group? How do we make things more inclusive? How do we celebrate intersectionality? We have to be thinking about all these different considerations that influence interactions between those that we're working with: age, ability, ethnicity, all these things. But there's other things that we have to think about when it comes to Indigenous communities, those other factors. Things like historical trauma, genocide, colonization, continued oppression, environmental issues, all these things trickle down and impact the Native person. So as we start to think about those things and take an active take in what impacts Native people, that's that action part. We're taking time and being culturally aware, culturally competent, by understanding, by learning, by coming to these talks and understanding how do we become more sensitive or more open. But we have to put things into action. We have to really think about what differences between action and understanding before we step into really trying to make things inclusive. We can talk about cultural appropriation. We can talk about microaggressions in full detail and have a real nice talk today. But what I wanted us to really focus on is our own biases that we have about other people. about the way we raise children, about the way we interact with children, because that's where I see the most appropriation happening. I see that with the way we talk about the way kids look, the way they sound, and I see it get reinforced in other types of youth programmings and in schools. So my hope is today we can, from what I know in my shared stories and my children, how I choose to raise my children, hopefully that gets you thinking more about that process of those immediate decisions, those priming instincts that you have, and saying that boys should have this, girls should be this, because we run into trouble there. With those survival instincts, those priming behaviors we have as humans, we run into trouble when we let those take over everything, when we don't allow for some type of mobility or some type of flexibility there. Pictured here is my son, Caleb. I always show this picture here in my talks about Native culture and about reparation work, because what we know about young children, Native children, is that they are being taught certain beliefs from the time they are born, being taught that this food is sacred or this way of doing stuff is sacred, and the body is sacred as well. However it comes, or whatever comes along and impacts and changes the body, that's okay. That's a sacred journey. All we do is move forward. We go forward and how things move. But what I want to bring attention to the hair. Native children, Navajo and Kisani, which means Pueblo in Navajo language, they grew up having a special relationship with hair. That most Navajo children are, in most cases, born with a good amount of hair, and it just gets longer quick. But that hair represents wisdom, growth, and a product of the brain, stuff happening there, stimulation happening there. And when you cut it, you're cutting off some of that wisdom. So that's one interpretation for why Navajo and Kisani people have long hair, is to show their wisdom, but also to recognize that product of the brain is visible. It's there, and we have proof of that. And when a young boy is allowed to tie up his hair either in the traditional bun or braid it like this, it means that this young person has teachings and beliefs that they were given from the time they were born. So when a Native child steps into a space where they're bullied or teased for having long hair, when all along they've been told that this is what it means, we run into in developmental research, we run into a trauma response, a ditch of the identity, the beliefs, that communal mastery these young kids have already at these young ages. They leave it, they walk away. And that's when we see assimilation and acculturation. During the boarding school era of Native children, or back when the Indian Removal Act came about, of trying to forcefully assimilate Native children with the boarding school, residential schools, this was a physical and intentional stripping of Native identity. I show these pictures here as a reminder of where we're at now, of dealing with historical attempts of genocide, and now dealing with oppression that we see, racism, discrimination, biases that young children have out because of what parents teach them or what the community or society teaches them. But I show these slides at this point to challenge that belief there and remind us about the importance, again, of that fluidity, those connections in the way children are raised, the beliefs that impact who they are, and also the way they navigate their space and their community as well. It's very interesting for me to watch, and I was just talking to AC very recently about gender socialization, because that's an area I'm really interested in, the development of young children and how they learn their space within their community. I feel like most American society, most American cultural groups, including Caucasian cultural groups, very often focus on this early need for independence, this early need to demonstrate the ability to be independent. Our take on that as being Diné and Pueblo is very different, and we say we want the exact same thing, But when we say that, we want a child to be independent so they can serve their community, so they can feed themselves and feed their people, but also be respectful and know where to go and how to respect the land. When we talk about independence, we focus on the child being able to express themselves how they want. Really different there when we talk about independence. How do we want kids to go and be and have that confidence to go and do what they want? And along the way, you teach them certain skills. These pictures here are of little Caleb learning to tie up his own hair, to be able to wear and rock his own earrings every day, native earrings, and he's wearing an arrowhead to protect himself. The pictures in the middle and the one on the left here are him going out and me just following him as he goes out and gathers food for our family. And I think these pictures here really resonate with me as I do more work in youth programming as well. Of we want kids to develop these skills, but how we're doing it or how we're facilitating some of that is actually contributing to assimilation as we try to fit kids into this stereotype of scouts or stereotype of being this particular youth program. And that's where I really want to draw attention to about how we can allow for more fluidity, to allow for more options and how we let children learn these skills, but still develop that character, develop that confidence, and also do things that are focused on true community navigation and true youth resilience. You don't have that unless your program lets children express themselves like this the way they want, while also still demonstrating that important skill that you want to get across or you have to focus on. I want to shift gears now. We're about midway through my talk. I want to really shift gears towards this concept of indigeneity, what it means to be indigenous, what it means to be Native American, American Indian, whatever you want to say. I don't have a preference for it. As long as you make sure at the end of the day, you acknowledge me as being Dene and Acoma Pueblo. This question here of who is an American is always a loaded one for me. Who makes an American? Am I an American? And when I see that flag flown, it brings a lot of emotion to me as I try to think of my work and how I raise my children and the work that I do with Native communities and with the focus on liberation, Indigenous liberation, of where we can speak freely, communicate freely, and be at those important discussion points of how do we teach, how do we raise young children, how do we make sure that they know both the way to walk in the moccasins, but also the way to walk in sneakers or boots or whatever it is. But what we know as we have more conversations about trauma and intergenerational effects is as a society, we don't learn from history. We always repeat ourselves. And even though we say history lessons are meant to avoid that, we don't. We always repeat ourselves. That's just what happens with American society. This picture here is of taken from early 1900s at Haskell. At the time was Haskell Industrial boarding school in Lawrence, Kansas. I trained at the University of Kansas. I did my master's and PhD there. And I worked closely with this institution here that's now a celebrated 4-year undergraduate university, but it has a dark past and it still has reminders of that dark paths of being a space of direct assimilation and very often complete assimilation where children from this very community that I'm in now, Chinle, Arizona, the heart of the Nepequea Navajo Nation, who were taken all the way to Northeast Kansas at a young age and stripped of their hair, their identity, and forced to learn this American way of life. Some of those children never made it back. Even further west of here, Hopi Nation, which is a smaller Pueblo tribe, there are children up at this school that never made it home, that are buried at the cemetery on this campus even to this day. That's just one institution. There are many out there. Hundreds were across the United States and in Canada. And we're starting to hear more about that dark history, that history that was hidden, that history we avoided and never talk about. But I hope by showing this picture, we keep these conversations going, and by making these connections to individuals that grew up in the same community I'm from, like Tom Torlino here, who is from Crown Point, New Mexico, which is very close to where I grew up. That these stories, I hope, resonate with you, and they're not just pictures in a history book or a Google image you look up during Native American Heritage Month, but that you remember that these individuals were either victims or survivors of genocide, and those stories that they tell were intergenerational. They still tell those stories. My grandparents tell stories. My aunts and uncles tell stories of the abuse, the emotional, the physical, the sexual abuse that happened in spaces that were meant to promote youth resilience, to promote growth, to promote education. I hope that's those words stick to you, because that's what you're doing in your community work, in your camps. You're teaching, you're advising, you're raising children. But think about that when working with Indigenous communities, that same attempt was made with in the past. It was a very devastating time, and we're not at a point now where we're actively engaging in that direct assimilation of Native youth, but it's still indirectly happening. We're still contributing microaggressions. We're still doing TP societies. We're still having the Order of the Arrow. We're still having all these groups that are detrimental to Indigenous youth and contribute to ongoing cultural appropriation, racism, and discrimination and oppression by saying that that's okay. By continuing to put an arrowhead on a white boy, a white girl in Midwest, and telling them this story and letting them grow and live on a reservation to have that experience, that's dehumanizing. I grew up on a reservation. I'm on a reservation right now. I'm working with youth in COVID response and trauma research right now, trying to keep kids from hurting themselves, trying to keep kids stimulated during this very stressful time, to help them, families and communities in my tribe, understand how historical trauma makes things even more complicated as we try to meet basic education needs of Navajo and Apache youth. While you're off wearing that arrow, or you're off living on your reservation, I want you to be thinking about that. Or if in the past you've contributed to that, and hopefully you're making things right. My hope is that you're thinking about these individuals, not just from the past, but the youth today, the Native youth who need you to tell their story correctly, and the non-Native youth where you need to correct their visions and those stereotypes. Because this is real. This is very real. Young kids, even as young as 8 and 9 years old, and this is Caleb here on the right again, making those connections of historical trauma, the boarding school, cutting of the hair, and making connections to institutions that are meant to teach, meant to help people grow, to learn new skills, to better themselves. I attended the University of Kansas, and my son was 3 at the time when we moved to Kansas. So he grew up on campus there. So he learned his Native side, but he also learned about the connection to the university, because he was always with me. But he started to get to an age where he made these connections of these attempts at assimilation. University of Kansas participated in the residential boarding school and supporting the local tribal college, the picture I showed earlier, Haskell Indian Nations University, and providing teachers and providing services and utilizing Native children labor to help build up the little community there. So little Caleb made this connection at 8, 9 years old of like, why, if you're part of this place of learning, why are you, and they did this in the past, what does that make you? And that's changed my whole way of how I have this conversation with others. Because I hope you have that moment too, of whether it's an activity, a lesson, or if you're engaging in those racist behaviors of Order of the Arrow, of those societies that are discriminatory. I hope you have those moments of where you have a child who asks those questions of, is this right? What are you doing? How are you contributing to ongoing oppression? And I had that moment myself with my son here at 8, 9 years old, when he was at a boarding school exhibit, and he made that connection to being Navajo, reading and seeing that Tom Torlino here was a survivor of the Indian boarding school era. And then seeing that Chancellor Lippincott, the University of Kansas, where I trained and was going to school at the time, contributed to some of this. These kids make connections. They make connections all the time from history books, but also in the media. And what I want us to be thinking about when that person on the receiving end who's a victim or a survivor or descendant of a victim or a survivor, that there's a rewounding that happens when these experiences happen. When someone says it's not a big deal, or when someone says I didn't mean it, or when someone says that's just how it is, that concept of erasure or just dehumanizing those experiences, we know happen not just with Indigenous people, it happens across many marginalized groups. But I want you to be thinking about how this rewounding effect from bias, stereotyping, microaggression, discrimination, intolerance, and that list can go on, of how that impacts the native brain, the young child brain. And I want us to spend some time reflecting during this song I'm going to play in a bit. It's just this, it's a still shot, but listen to the lyrics. Really listen to these lyrics. I'm going to play the full song, and be ready to put some to interact with the chat box in a bit. And so I'm going to play it now. I'm going to drink of water, and I'll let you listen.
Personally, I should prefer to see the Aborigines. And the Indians, too. And the Indians, too. This should be most enlightening.
Makes the red man red. Teach them all about red man. Teach them all about red man. Red man.
Empty books, like holidays, like Thanksgiving lies and Christmas Day. Tell me what I know more than the teacher. Tell me what I know more than the preacher. Tell me why you think the red man is red. Stained with the blood from the land who bled. Tell me why you think the red man is dead. It's a fake headdress on his head. Tell me what you know about thousands of nations. Displaced and confined to concentration camps, all reservations. These died for the birth of your nation. Hollywood betrays us wrong. History books say we're gone. You got a church, say we're wrong. We're from the earth, it's real strong.
Do you want to stay here and look like savages? Like savages?
Savages, that's how it's done. The white man came in, and it's done. Caused genocide. Look in my eyes and tell me what you think the savage was.
Ill face.
Savages?
Ill face.
Savages?
Alien celebration continued to the night.
That's destiny, arrest me, best for me to kill a culture. America made a mess of me. You inherited everything we died for, and all we get is a goddamn mascot. And that's destiny, arrest me, best for me to kill a culture. America made a mess of me. You inherited everything we died for, and all we get is a goddamn mascot.
Many moons, red man like Bill fails face. Sometimes you win, sometimes we race.
When you kill my people, made me red when you bled my tribe. Made me red when you kill my people.
Savages? Like savages?
That's your view in you.
Savages?
What I want you to do now is to go over to that chat box. Don't post anything yet, but when I tell you to, I want you to add into that chat box how what emotion you're feeling now, or any thoughts or words that you have. I want us to all put it in at the same time. Go over, type it in, don't send yet, but when I tell you to, go ahead and put it in. I'll give you a couple seconds to think. After watching that, how are you feeling? What are you thinking? What is your reaction? What is your response? And put it in 3, 2, 1, send. Thank you to those of you who are putting stuff in. Continue to add more and ground here, and let's ground ourselves here and really think about next steps now. We talked about historical trauma. We made connections and realized that these feelings that we're having now are healthy feelings as we think about trying to change up how we're doing stuff with Native people. The month of Native American Heritage Month, and even starting in October with Indigenous Peoples Day, these are really emotional times for Native people, because we have to relive these wounds. We have to really take a stance, because this is when people are paying attention to our stories, our conversations, our teachings. And so I'm glad we're doing this at the beginning of December, because we've now had all that happen. We had those conversations. I participated in many panels over the past 2 months. So as we get closer to this calendar new year, this change in time, let's prioritize how we're feeling now, and let's think about how we change that and channel that into change, systemic change, in the work that we're doing as youth advocates and teachers. Thank you again for being vulnerable and sharing very common responses that I have after showing this video. That's Frank Wan. He's a Sikanjo Lakota man, a brother, a relative, someone that joins me in these types of discussions, and previously joined me at the University of Kansas, my alma mater, to lead these discussions more on how media, how microaggressions impact the Native brain. I'm a speech language pathologist. I love my field. I wanted to be an SLP since I was about 11, 12 years old. And I've always been interested into communication. I've always been interested in linguistics and development of young children. And so when I see these microaggressions happening, these stereotyping that happens in my field, in the very, what I would think of as being minimal, at least, that this disregard, these microaggressions happening that were just, they snuck in. But all it takes is that one person to make that connection of like, this doesn't make sense, or this is offensive, for it to change that entire interaction with my field, my profession. What you see here are articulation sheets produced by Super Duper, and this is still out in print. These stereotyping of Native people and other racial groups as well, through images and through routines that just don't make any sense to the actual community. I have relatives up in Aluktik and who are Alaska Native, from the other side of the Arctic Circle down to South Alaska as well, and then into Canada. These individuals are strong, resilient people, but there's diversity amongst Alaska Natives as well. And the way that we portray brothers and sisters being up north, here being misrepresented is offensive. Here in the plains, relatives who were strong, resilient, and were the ones that fought back for the longest against the US government. Warriors, societies that very much to this day continue to fight back against US government oppression. Societies that fly that flag upside down and still speak their language and still fight back against pipelines. Those are the Lakota, the strong people, the warrior society. And here they're being presented at being at mealtime with the cockroach on the blanket and just teepees and designs that are culturally appropriated. I want you to be thinking about that. We can't fix every single thing right away, but we can make movement by thinking about communities that are still recovering from trauma, not just Indigenous people, not just racial ethnic minority groups, but as we think about how to make things better, how to bring about change, we have to not just focus on one group. There's a collective, there's a community we have to be thinking about. We have to do this from a social justice lens, but we can also start by simply relearning history, by relearning about child development, and knowing that sometimes when we overlook that, when we focus too much on politics, on policy, on things that we think are important, we continue to contribute to genocide, misappropriations. We continue to harm the most vulnerable, the future, the generation. In Native culture, we have this belief of this always thinking ahead for the 7th generation and the work that we're doing, the way we're taking care of the land, the way we're teaching. We have to always be thinking 7 generations down the road. And this is what my relatives, my ancestors have been talking about for a long time. And I am that 7th generation. And what we've seen happen from through colonization and continued oppression and various social injustices is we see the 7th generation, not just the Indigenous generation, but other communities to be harmed or to be repeating history. So now is our time to kind of change that scene, to not just be focused on politics and policies and laws and all these things, to really meet at empathy, to really think about and prioritize that 7th generation down the road, that 8th, the 9th, to 10th. Because that's how we can bring about change, that we may have a way, we may be able to shift and change the dark and gloomy path we're on right now. But we can't do that without understanding history, without first acknowledging the need to think of from an intersectional lens. I mentioned earlier about fluidity across gender identity and allowing Native children to be able to develop on their own, to express themselves and to navigate and step into spaces that either in the land, in the school, or in their households, to be able to have a voice. This is where we start. I think we can do this even in camp spaces and other recreational activities if we can change up how we've been doing things in the past. Trying to promote a certain skill, a certain curriculum, but actually making time to think about what's a priority to this community, what skills are going to be helpful to them, what things in my organization, my curriculum are discriminatory, are forcing kids to develop in a way that's not their way of life. I use the rainbow a lot in my social media contexts and awareness activities, and because that rainbow really, which was taken from and used and is used in a good way by the LGBTQ plus community, but that rainbow to the Indigenous person represents a journey of balance, a journey of harmony, and very much represent a life stage, whatever it is. It's not about gender, it's not about sexuality, it's about journey, whatever it is. And that rainbow starts up on top and it goes around. It represents infancy to geriatrics, but it also represents the fluidity across gender, across sexuality, across education, child rearing. And I always use that rainbow because I was taught rainbow songs early on. And those rainbow songs in my culture are what are meant to promote that developmental trajectory in Native children. So I use the rainbow a lot to talk about that journey that young children take. And I want to emphasize that these beliefs are at that below surface piece, that deep culture. Earlier I mentioned that surface level, things we see in people, clothes, food, how people interact, how they look like. But what we don't often think about is that those deep beliefs, those unspoken rules, Those norms, those teachings in Indigenous communities, very often those are oral teachings, oral traditions. And in most cultures, they are oral traditions. You learn how to participate in church because someone teaches you. You learn how to learn a certain trade because someone teaches you. Sometimes that gets put into books or into print, and we can read those and we can learn that skill. But things like understanding space, nonverbal behaviors, understanding of adulthood, transition to adulthood, those things sometimes are very fluid and very oral, how those things are facilitated, and they often, again, are intersectional. So I remind ourselves about the importance of cultural competence, the need to understand culture, those interactions, those beliefs, those patterns that we have established among certain groups. But this competence piece is very, very important. The need to understand where we're at on this stage of competence is so vital to working with any cultural group. What I presented early about the boarding school era, that was at a point of cultural destruction, when we were contributing to active destroying of a different culture. It was intentional, it was direct, it was out there, it was purposeful. What we see sometimes ourselves as a society is being at a point where we think we can't do anything, where we see the tomahawk chops at football games, or we see mascots out there, or we see Native people dressing up as Native princesses during Halloween. We see those stereotypes and we feel like we can't do anything. This is when we don't even know that this is happening. We watch a video, we make what we happened earlier with most of you and saying like, that was Peter Pan. I didn't see that happened. That was we are sometimes at that point where we feel like we can't do anything. But there is things we can do, but we'd never want to be at a state of being in the cultural blindness. This is that person that says, my children don't see color, I don't see color, everything is unbiased. We want the exact opposite. We want people to see color. We want people to see differences and be okay with that. When we start to move on that continuum towards competence, which again is an ongoing process, you never reach a stage. Many of us that are here learning or doing this work, we're advocating, we're actively pursuing knowledge, we're recognizing that cultural differences exist, and we acknowledge those, and we're okay with that, or we try to step into uncomfortable spaces. Many of you are here, you're being vulnerable, you're answering my questions, and you're listening to me. My hope is we can start to move towards this place of acceptance and mutual respect, where there's a continual expansion of knowledge because we're wanting to learn, we're wanting to listen, we're wanting to bring about change. We're constantly seeking advice and consultation. That's what we strive for as professionals. But what I want you to aim for is proficiency. I want you to be thinking where you're promoting cultural relations amongst Indigenous and other diverse groups, where you're holding our culture, our beliefs, our teachings at very high esteem, and you're letting us be part of these major decisions that are happening in your organization. Not only that, but you're also looking at the value that our own youth child rearing practices have value, and sometimes they're probably even stronger than some of the work that you're doing. But I want you to be also thinking about how do you address the structural and symbolic violence that exists across camp culture, camp societies as well. Your work is definitely needed. There are communities that are still in need. There are still a need to develop and work and engage with different diverse partners in different communities. So your work is it's not unappreciated. But what I hope we can do is visiting and having continued conversation about community bias and stereotyping. And again, I hope this is just a reminder. So I'm skipping a lot of this, of how this training and how these discussions need to happen. Because you're working with diverse communities. And when you actively take part in bias training and challenging yourself to change up how you're thinking, to respond more rather than react, we can help ourselves to see things from a different lens. So we're not only responding aggressively, we're taking time to process what's happening. Like this image I'm showing here, this is another slide that I often show too when closing out my discussions about bias and about stereotyping. We all have them. We all make those immediate responses. Our brain gets challenged, and many times when we see stuff that very much challenges how we are supposed to see or how we're supposed to understand, that's okay, that's healthy. My hope is we can continue to do that, not just with race and ethnicity, but the way we see time, the way we see communities, and also even down to gender. But it does take self-awareness. It does take learning more about yourself. It does take understanding more of your personal worldview. We all have beliefs, values. We all been told certain things, but with that comes the bias. And so I hope we can continue to present and talk about this concept and these teachings from an intersectional lens. But I want to bring us back to, what do we do about Indigenous communities? How do we make sure we are coming back to them to give input to what we're doing? Because what I want you to remind you about is that these teachings of resilience, of hope and well-being, those things that we target in our youth work, that is there in Indigenous communities. It's there, and if they're not practicing it, it needs to be revitalized. And in the net language and the Pueblo languages, we have words for all different parts of the corn. But we also have language and ways to describe what the corn does when people are around it, when people dance with it, when the water comes in from the irrigation. But we also have words for how people were interacting with certain types of corn, the white corn, the blue corn, the red corn. My grandfather on my dad's side is a yellow corn clan because he was keeper of those corn. My other clan on my Acoma side is the Parrot clan, and the Parrot come from South America, but we traded with South American indigenous groups and were keepers of those macaws, those ways of life. When you teach a child the history and story of what their clans are, who their kinship ties are, that's when we can really think about those influencers of learning, how children learn and how they develop these important skills. And then that's when we realize it's not just a summer program, it's not just a school-based program, it takes a community effort to raise Native children. So I want to close out by first, I'm not going to have time for that, but I want to end with this activity here. And this is that assignment that I have for you. And again, I hope this was a touch on historical trauma, a touch on cultural competency, and a touch on indigeneity and indigenous knowledge systems. What I want you to do moving forward is to really explore what you talked about. And I'm going to share how I do this for myself, because I have biases, I have stereotypes as well. But running myself through this activity is especially important because it grounds me. And I hope it does when you run this activity yourself. I am Joshuaa Allison-Burbank. I am from dirt roads, from Spam and Nikes. I am from the dusty and brown valley between mesas and canyons. I am from the cedar tree and the red clay dirt. I am from songs of resiliency, from Shema, Do Shije, Do Shike. I am from many obstacles and the many teachings, from being told to look the white man in his eyes and the learning to wake up before the sun rises. I did that this morning. I am from the sand paintings and sweat lodge. I am from the Nebuchadnezzar born and raised, from steamed corn stew and Piccadillys, from the matriarchs of the family, the tough but gentle man and the many, many cousins. I am from the Hogan on the dusty hill, on a journey to figure out what my ancestors want me to do, because only I can be the one to protect what I know. When I first started off on this journey of trying to be an advocate and trying to be an ally, I wanted to know, what do I do with this community? What skills do I need to develop? And I was told by Barbara Rodriguez, my mentor at the University of New Mexico, who's a speech therapist herself, that said, you don't need to go and master all those things. You run into trouble by doing that. It starts by you exploring your own beliefs, your own values, and learning that those things that you were taught early on have meaning. Sometimes they lead you in to have that clash with other communities, other groups, and that's okay, because that makes you who you are. But this self-exploration, this reflection on who you are, allows time for you to see where that bias comes from, where the stereotyping comes from. To take a look back and say like, oh, I was impacted by watching an offensive Disney movie a couple of years ago. And now I have this belief that Native people always wear feathers or their faces are always red. I hope this activity does that for you. And I hope you also remember too, that we're not the leathered and feathered. We are doing very much the same thing you are doing as well. But we're also holding on to tradition, culture, and language as best as we can. And my hope is that we are thinking again about young Native children, what's going through their head, what experiences they have, the many roles that they're balancing, the many paths that they're being asked to walk on. And let's really think about how we can be open to that, to building on their strengths, to letting those influencers of learning, the ones that have the knowledge of the land, of the food, of the space, that those knowledge keepers be part of your youth work. Because that 7th generation is going to be the ones that bring about change. And my hope today is we at least get this conversation going, and that we can continue beyond Native American Heritage Month to work towards reparation, reconciliation, and prioritizing indigeneity when the community is there and interested. Thank you for joining me today. It's been a pleasure. Yehat in my language, Kawatsi from my dad's language. I hope you go off and have a great day, and I hope this conversation continues. Thank you.
Joshua, we all want to thank you so much for being here today. It was an incredible presentation. I dropped a couple of your resources in the chat box, so the link to the poem as well as the video. I have a good feeling we're going to be asking you to come back because there's so much more discussion to be had. So again, grateful for everyone's participation today. And Joshua, if you want to put your email in the chat box in case folks have questions or want to connect afterwards, if you feel comfortable with that.
Absolutely, it's in there. Thank you for inviting me, and yeah, let's keep in touch. Everyone have a great day.
All right, thanks everyone.
All right, bye.